Fabulous. Let's get started. Thanks for coming today. This is actually a repeat of what we did last year at this time, actually. So let me introduce Marco Buti. Marco is the Chief Economist of the European Commission. For those of you who don't know, the European Commission is a delegated body that effectively implements policy on behalf of the member states to ensure that growth, prosperity and all the good stuff is distributed evenly through Europe. They're actually probably the most powerful transnational bureaucracy in the world. As a consequence, when things aren't going well, as they were about 5 or 6 years ago, the Commission becomes a bit of a political football. But at the same time, when you're trying to embed more Europe in an environment of populism, which is where we have today, the Commission is the instrument that you have and the one that you have to hope works if you believe in a positive European future. Last time, Marco came along and spoke about an ambitious reform agenda which the Commission was launching called Structural Reform 2.0, which was moving away from labour market reforms to stress private sector rent-seeking, the non-collection of taxes, revenues, etc. And although these guys don't do this stuff with great political fanfare because they are a technocratic institute rather than a political institute, so they can't toot their own horn in the same way, this has actually been quite impactful. If one thinks about the data protection regulations which are coming out of Europe just now, which threaten to seriously upset digital monopolies. If you think about the ability to go after, the attempt to go after Ireland for the back taxes for Apple, the closing down of the Luxembourg, Irish tax loops, etc. There's been a whole host of reforms which have been both revenue raising and also, I would say, legitimacy enhancing at this point in time for what Europe is doing. So Marco is going to tell us what's going on now in the context of populism, the thing that we're all concerned with. So this is how the Commission thinks about it, and we will have a conversation about it amongst ourselves. Marco is going to talk. I will offer some questions by way of a short interview after, based upon what he says, and then we open it up to Q&A. So we'll begin. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark. Is indeed, it is a repeat of last year. Actually, I was here exactly 1 year ago, so I have the Halloween, you know, the Halloween mode for that I spend around. I mean, there is something that is in common when I come here now. This is the second time. Is that I have chosen and proposed to Mark items which. Put me a bit out of my comfort zone. So last year I talked about incompatible political trinities in the European Union, bringing in the economics, political economy, institutional matters, and this year I talked about populism. So I'm not coming, say here, representing precisely official views of the Commission, but these are more my own reflections, and hopefully they will. Impact the policy directions of in Europe somehow. So what is the plan of the day? Let's see if it works out. Here. Okay. So there's a lot to talk about populism, quite an increase in literature. I mean, we were talking with Mark before coming here. Interesting short paper by the Center for Economic Reform, European Reform in London that just issued a paper this morning. Yesterday there has been a quite comprehensive report by a number of researchers from the Center for European Policy Research with Barry Eichengreen, André Sapir, and others issued a couple of weeks ago. There is a forthcoming paper on demand and supply of populism, which is still in form of a working paper by Guizzo and others. So economists as well as political scientists, they take this at heart, and it is clearly the name of the game, and if we want to understand clearly the events and policy directions, developments on this side of the Atlantic and on the other side of the Atlantic, so in Europe, I think getting a grip on the populist trends, I think, and understanding the underpinning of this is important. So this is the plan. So what is populism? I think I bring you some evidence on growing populism, but I'm not going to go through an horizontal analysis, more of getting a snapshot on recent cases. So I look at look at Brexit, I look at France, so the recent presidential elections, the even more recent elections in Germany, and Austria and the Czech Republic. All these have had elections, even, I mean, take Austria, the Czech Republic, just 1 or 2 weeks ago. And then some policy dilemmas which emerge from this analysis. Now, let's start with where we should be, which is choosing a working definition of populism. And actually, when you have looking for a definition, I mean, a good place to start is the Encyclopedia Britannica. So how do they define populism or populists there? And the definition of Encyclopedia Britannica is the following. Populists claim to promote the interests of common citizens against the elite. They pander to people's fears and enthusiasm, and they promote policies without regard of the long-term consequences of the country. So this is the definition, I mean, one of the definitions. And what you have here is I've tried to, let's say, to disentangle a bit this into 3 elements. One is the anti-establishment features of populism. So championing the little man, in contrast with the corrupted elite. So this anti-establishment. The second is anti-pluralism. Populists are against and anti-pluralism by claiming to have the exclusive legitimacy of popular representation without intermediation. Actually, before coming here this morning, having breakfast, I was reading the what is the Providence Post, the Providence Journal. And first of all, let me say I'm going to talk about Europe, so we may talk about the US during the conversation. But I was reading the declaration, quoting the article this morning of Kevin McCarthy, so the leader of the Republican party in the Congress, and they said for Trump, they said almost literally, he says he appeals. This president has been elected by appealing directly to the people, and he does not want to have any let's say outside influence in that. So no filters. Though this a bit what you get in the definition of populism also. So the exclusive representation of and legitimacy by appealing directly to people, and they believe that political and social goals are better achieved by direct action. So anti-representativeness. So anti-establishment, anti-pluralism, anti-representative, this is what you get. And populists are, you know, from the extreme right, from the extreme left, but also from the extreme center. You have also, so it is not a characterization that necessarily put, you know, populists on the right side of the political spectrum. So if you take, and usually in the literature, and actually in the paper I was mentioned it before that we were commenting with Mark before coming here, you had exactly these 2 perspectives. One is an economic reading of the populist phenomenon, and another one is more of a cultural and identitarian reading. So the first one is links essentially to the rising income and wealth inequality, as well as economic insecurity, but among those left behind basically in the globalization. And on the cultural and identity, so it's the reaction towards progressive cultural change resulting from you know, intergenerational shift towards post-material values. So cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism. So these are the feeling of losing identity. No? That is the second. And you can try to map here who is on the right-hand side, who is here on the left-hand side, and you can read yourself here who are the, let's say, the you know, groups of the population which are, they are more sensitive to the economic, economic feeling of insecurity and inequality, and those who instead are more, they're more appeal in relation to cultural identitarian values. And there is an element of overlapping between these two group of people. If you have less educated, are also those who have less hope and profit less from the current trends, from the opportunities of globalization. So there is a clear overlapping, at least in part, between the two. By the way, I'm not going to talk much about Eastern European countries, but if you look at the events in Poland, recently in Hungary, actually you have the fusion a bit of these two groups here there in particular. We may go back to that in the Q&A if you so wish. Now, if one looks at evidence of populism, here you find the share of the vote won by populist party according to economic or left or right-wing program in national parliamentary elections and European parliamentary elections since the 1960s, and you can see that clearly going up. If you would add the recent, I think recent elections, it would still go up even more. And you see it also on the right-hand side for individual countries. This is the 2016, so the recent elections are not covered by this. So there is clearly a tendency towards an increase in the share of populist parties, and it comes from far away, so it is not just a very recent phenomenon. Now, as I mentioned before, that we'll look at the, let me look at this also, is the working class and low skilled experience globalization more as a threat than as an opportunity. You can see it here, answering the question whether globalization is a threat to economic anxiety and traditionalism, and it is very much related to the level of education here. And here the level of education means that you more or less awareness, but also more or less opportunities that you have from venturing in an open world. Now, if one goes to individual experiences, I'm going to do, as I mentioned before, I'm going to do 2 slides per country. Look at the Brexit, look at France, so the presidential election of last May, and then Germany, and the other couple of countries. So the first thing here is that in the case of Brexit, it seems to be immigration, not economic inequality, which is a powerful engine. And you can see it here. I don't know if it is possible. Is there a? No, sorry, I think I made a mess here. No, is a pointer here? Should be here? No. No.
Oh, there is one. There is one. Go down a little bit. Go back. There.
Okay, here it is. Here you have it. So asked what is the most important issue facing Britain today, you can see those voting for Brexit rather than voting for remaining there in the referendum of June 2016. You can see clearly that immigration is the most important worry, together with terrorism. Here you see terrorism here also. They are not very much worried about the economy, so inequality or economy in general. Those who are worried about that, they voted for staying. So they understood that in terms of the economy, you exit, you are most likely to be out in the wilderness rather than having all the opportunities that global Britain has been promised to by the Brexiteers. So here it seems, at least prima facie, that immigration is the one that is driving the vote. What is interesting here, and it is this chart, I find is pretty illuminating, and you find certain elements in common also with other countries, is that it seems to be the change in immigration over the past years, rather than the share of the population of that foreign-born in a particular region. Actually, if you look here in the upper graph, you see that if anything, there is a negative correlation here between vote for leave and the foreign-born population. So those with high share of foreign-born population, the majority of actually was for remaining in. Look at Boston. Okay, Boston, not Boston here. It's Boston is on exactly. So it is 65,000 smallish town in England. But if you move from the graph above to the graph below, then the correlation, if anything, tends to inverse. You see that it's more of a positive one, and Boston is a clear, let's say, is a clear exception. Clear exception, not an exception, but a clear manifestation of that. So the positive correlation seems to tell you that the vote for exiting is stronger in regions and counties where you have the increase in the foreign population over the past years. So it seems to be the delta rather than the absolute value. And you can see that more as an element of shock coming from the change in the population of foreign origin, rather than the fact that there is a large number. They are established, maybe they are well integrated, maybe well, yes or no, but I think it doesn't seem to drive the political preference. So I think this is interesting. Immigration, but the change more than the absolute value. So this is as far as the UK is concerned. If you move to France, and here, I mean, one can bring in more the economic dimension of the two readings that I indicated before. And what you can see here, the social hardship seems to count. Here, what you have is the vote in the first round of the parliamentary, of the presidential elections in France in May. And what you can see here in particular, look at the vote for Emmanuel Macron, who eventually won in the second round, which is this here. So it's, let's say, dark yellow, and then you have dark brown Marine Le Pen. So just focus on these two. And what you can see clearly that if you take this is the map of the vote. If you take the north here, where you have the index here of social hardship, so this which brings together unemployment, poverty, youngsters without diploma, and single-parent families. You can see actually that the vote for Le Pen here and the vote where this indicator of social hardship is stronger is actually quite strongly correlated. You can see it in the north. You can see it in the south, you see, here, and somehow also here on in the western part. And for Macron, where you can see that there is actually the region is doing well, you can see the vote for Macron is higher. So take the Brittany here, yeah, you see it's pretty clear here. I would like look also at, it's okay, difficult to look, but Paris is around here. Paris is actually pretty dark, but votes for Macron. So it doesn't vote for Le Pen. So one of the elements that emerged clearly, and this is a bit across the board in different countries, is the divide between rural and urban. So the rural divide is one important element here. So you can see that this is France, and then France again. And here it seems that an educated center versus a less well-educated periphery seem to be important in driving the vote. Here you can see that this is back +3, this is tertiary education. And you can see clearly that the vote for Marine Le Pen versus the vote for Macron, there is a huge difference. There is a large difference here, but it's reduced, and then eventually it reverses. So baccalaureate, this is the first level of tertiary education, and then you go to secondary education, and below it is clear that the Le Pen vote outweighs the one for Macron quite largely. And you can look at the periphery, so this is the Paris and around, and then towns of smaller towns, and then the rural, and you can see clearly that Macron here outweighing, clearly dominating vote, and the opposite happening the more you go outside into the periphery. So this, I think, is something that is pretty telling also. If we move to Germany, here you have seen Germany. There has been a confirmation of Mrs. Merkel as the chancellor, but there is a large surge of Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, which is the right-wing party. For those who do not know that, I mean, the Alternative for Deutschland was born about 6 or 7 years ago. It was essentially a group of economics professors who were against the so-called transfer union, against the saving Greece, so they were the anti-Euro intellectuals. And progressively they have moved towards a more xenophobic right-wing tendency. And actually some of the professors who initially were in favor, they actually left, and there has been a split in the party. It has become more of also a negationist party. Clearly 12.6% is large considering the German history. It has never been in the past since 1945 an extreme right-wing nationalist party in Germany. We know what happened before 1945, so it is relevant. Obviously, it is not. It did not threaten the to get into power, but clearly it's an important phenomenon. But if you look at here again, there was where the AfD has stronger support. It has stronger support in the new lenders. Is what the former Eastern Germany. And what you can see also here, that is a bit like with Brexit. I think you have the it fared best where foreign born population is the lowest. So it is not where you have a huge amount. It is the opposite. And here also the age. So the generational divide actually counts a lot. You have a share of people aging 60 or over, which to a certain extent is also worrying, because one would expect that the historical memory lasts more for older generation. It doesn't seem to be the case. So this is a bit of a quick snapshot on Germany. And SPD, so Social Democratic Party, has with 22% is the lowest score in the ever. And what you can see also here is that he has suffered most in economically depressed parts. So if you take this is the change in the SPD vote, and you see that it's especially where you have large unemployment that they have lost more. And this, in a sense, is paradigmatic a bit of the crisis of the center-left, across the Western society, and in particular in Europe. If you look at what happened in beside Germany, in France, with also the party was the fifth in the presidential elections. So 8% of the vote for the PS, so the Socialist Party. If you look at what happened also in the Blairist party in the UK, what happened also in Spain. So there is an overall crisis of the party that have made basically the European social models as we know it. So the combination of let's say open markets and solidarity, and trying to keep together the two corners of the issue. So in a sense, it is more of an issue for the center left, for the center right. And then you can also, very quickly here on Austria. Austria, the elections were actually last week. Here you can see that the FPO, it is the extreme right, which has won about 26% of the vote. So it was the third party, but very close to this is the Social Democrats. This is the Christian, so the conservative Christian Democrats. It is the highest since the end of the 70s. And you can see also here that if you look at the levels of education, you get the same pattern as that you have seen in other countries. What is interesting here is that the OVP, which is the Christian Democrats Conservatives, they have actually, on migration, they have actually adopted a policy which were very close to those of the extreme right. So in a sense, they have gone to eat and fish in the same pond as the extreme right. If you look at the Czech Republic, here again also last week, you see this new party, ANO, which is basically ANO means is the party of the dissatisfied citizens. You can see that has surged quite a lot, and here also you see a pattern of again high education, education actually determining the party. And if you get together the anti-establishment party together with the pirates and together with the SPD, the far right, you see over 50% of the electorate in the Czech Republic voting for so-called populist party. So this is the overall picture. If one tries to sum up with this sparse evidence, you can see. So one can conclude again. I mean, young Europeans have been lost hope, low wage, long-term unemployed. Tend to vote for the populist party. The early less educated right-wing authoritarians also. So this against the spread, feeling threatened by the spread of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism. Migration is at the center of that. It is a thing you perceived versus real. That's what you would seem to get. Sometimes it's more the perception, the fear, the threat, rather than the actual experience. There is a clear rural-urban divide. In the case of Germany, I think the divide here is that the risk of being left out, which actually characterizes the behavior in new lenders in the Eastern, so the former German Democratic Republic, and the mainstream center party suffer most, so the European model at risk, and the integration model not being accepted in Eastern Europe, where there is rise of so-called illiberal democracy. I mean, according to the definition of Farid Zahari in his book of 1997, actually by Prime Minister Orban in Germany, in Hungary, in a speech in 2014, actually indicating clearly that was the model. Illiberal democracy has been the model for Hungary in the future. So this is a bit the summing up. So if we go from this to the policy dilemmas, okay, there is one element which I think is important. Take the view of, let's say, the economic view of the cultural identitarian view. Take the left of the right. There is a common thread in all this, a common element. They are all against Europe. So all against the EU. So why so? this is a way, I think, to read the let's say economic populism. If one thinks that the economic populism is nourished, actually underpinned by fear of insecurity, by rejection of economic inequality, then you can say look at the issue according to this simple conceptual framework here. So, where do inequalities and insecurity lie? Where are they born? And if you look at it, you can see that they are born either in the pre-market in terms of endowments, so endowments in terms of physical and human capital. So they can be born there. So before youngsters like you enter into the market, or they can do that in the market transactions. So when you enter the labor market and naturally you try to find a job, or in the post-market, which is, let's say, the functioning of the welfare systems, which tends to, let's say, to equalize incomes via tax and benefit system. So these are the three moments, the three moments. And Europe, the way it works now, because of the competencies that we have, we essentially operate in the second dimension. Yes, we have some programs for education and culture, we have some programs on human capital, we have cohesion funds for the regions left behind, but the main feature of Europe is actually to open markets, to liberalize. We have a very strong competence on competition policy. We have established and police the single market. We apply rules in terms of public finances and debt and deficit, etc. So we essentially operate here. We have very little competencies in the pre-market, and we have very little competencies in the post-market. All this, the pre-market and the post-market, the policy responsibility is at the level of the member states, of the national governments. So, but populist forces, what do they do? The EU tries to bring down walls, economic walls in particular, and populist forces, they operate exactly in the same dimension by trying to do the opposite. So the clash between the EU and populist forces is direct because we actually operating in the same policy dimension, which is this intermediate one, which is market integration and liberalization. So this is I think one of the reasons why they tend to be against Europe. If you take the other perspective, which is the identitarian, the more cultural populism, you can see that also here the clash between the populist views and the EU is actually pretty direct. We have an element of, let's say, an objective of convergence between countries, and this is described by, in a sense, homogenization, threat perceived as erasing national identities by those who want to describe it like that. We are in for the rule of law, protection of minorities, and the populist, we have seen the definition at the very beginning, they rule by the majority basically, and by no longer silent majority. So the EU is essentially in favor of protecting minorities and avoiding the dictatorship of the majority, and the dictatorship majority is precisely by the appeal directly to the people that you get into populist. And essentially, EU is based on rules and institutions, sometimes very complex and not very transparent, which are intermediate filters in the decision making. And the populist appeal, especially those on the identitarian side, they appeal to direct democracy, referenda, Twitter policy making, alleged to filters of any type. So you can see those who are more motivated by cultural and by identity, they tend to be against Europe. So we are the frontal, let's say in the sense, the frontal attack for populists. So moving from this diagnosis to the policy response, I think essentially try to capture that into this. So you take, usually the answer is that the simple but wrong, and then you get off the cliff here. And the complicated, complex but right, and you can see that the path here is pretty impervious, no? And up, uphill. You see a lot then tending to go to the left, and not a few taking a book, going to the right. Now the policy dilemmas, and here I think is my final slides are. Okay, here the first one is the answer more Europe or less Europe in this? More involvement of the European Union, more European integration, or going back to the member states. I think if you take a view that is essentially those of taking a more cultural, identitarian view, they tend to see rules, the blurring of responsibilities between national governments and by EU as an element of concern. So one would say, okay, probably less Europe, so repatriate a number of competencies to have clear assignment, more transparency. Those who take more of a view of an economic, of the economic type, if you go back to what I mentioned before, the pre-market, market, and post-market, I would say, okay, you cannot remain in that intermediate phase only. That is not a political equilibrium. So Europe should also deal with distributional concerns. So distributional concerns in terms of opportunities, which is the pre-market phase, and the distributional concern in terms of post-market welfare issues, which is the post-market dimension. But it would imply more Europe. So there is a tension here between less and more Europe. But the second one is, I think, call it here different Europe. I think the focus on new European public goods, I think, is important. And for this, I mentioned. I'm referring in particular to the migration policy, defense, economic security more generally. And if you look at the current distribution of the EU budget, we still spend half of the budget on common agricultural policy. It seems to me we are looking into the rear window. So I think the focus here on what is try to respond to the legitimate quest of the population is important, but it's not. There is a very, very high inertia in the EU finances and how to shift the policies and the resources onto new public goods is difficult. We have to build bridges between different positions, and here the risk here is to lose coherence in the policies. So how you marry German view, which is very rules-based, emphasizing responsibility and reduction of risks, compared to the more French view, which is emphasizing more solidarity and risk sharing. I think is an important element, but it's an important, it's a difficult dilemma. But if we do not find a proper equilibrium there, I think we still be prey of allegations from the two sides. I think we have a window of opportunity with the elections of Emmanuel Macron, who is for the first time in France clearly coming out with an explicit pro-European program. France has traditionally been very sovereignist. So for the first time, I think he has won the elections on an explicit and proactive European approach. This is, compared to Mrs. Merkel. Mrs. Merkel is herself, I think, a pro-European leader, but a reluctant one. So Mrs. Merkel has never really made the case for Europe. I think she had the chance this time, and she missed it, to make the case in a proactive way for Europe, instead of preaching the virtue of the German model independently of Europe, which clearly has not helped in bringing the population with you. So I think we have a window of opportunity there, but the threat of populism is still there. So the answer to the very first question is the high tide of populism in Europe over? My answer would be not yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we got to 1:30, so I'm going to monopolise a few minutes of time just to bring some issues out. As ever, great presentation, and I agree. And the debate, as you know, has become somewhat less polarised. There was an attempt, particularly with the election of Trump, to bring that into the conversation. One has to be on one side or the other. It's either all economics or it's all identity. And what I think is really good about what Marco has shown us is basically these things are situation specific. And cultural reference are always got economic backing, and the economy is always experienced in different ways culturally. So I just want to pull on a couple of those themes. So you identify three critical variables going into this. Age is very important, level of education is very important, and the degree of economic hardship is very important. So here's a policy question, and I just mean this in general terms, not just for the Commission, but thinking about governments in general. If the key thing is education and age, we can say, well, society evolves one funeral at a time, but that's not a good public policy. The next one is, well, if everyone are just basically become more intolerant and more xenophobic, and it's a level of education question, how do you educate people to be less racist? That's a really big ask, right? As a policy, now, if something's underlying it as an economic problem, I know what to do with that. Because if it's a question of distribution, you can shift the distribution. But if it really is a case that there are these kind of exogenous preferences which have become more expressed now, that there is simply more intolerance. Even amongst people, in the wonderful slides that you see, the German and Boston, Lincolnshire effect, whereby the people who have the least contact with migrants are the most migrant phobic, right? How do you deal with that as a public policy problem? I'd just like to ask you that. What's your thoughts on that? Because economics, we can in principle know what to do. But what do you do with that kind of culturally driven exclusion? What do you think?
Difficult to deal with is part of if one wants to spell out the policy dilemmas at the end in a more granular way, that would be one of the questions. I think a number of concerns which are expressed by those who then express their vote in favor of populist parties are real. Mm-hmm. So I think the fears related to the arrival of migrants, also arrival migrants of a different cultural background, with in which the fear that they would not really want to be fully integrated mm-hmm. and embrace the Western set of values, I think is not something that one can dismiss out of hand. And I mean, there is sometimes taking a cosmopolitan view of that. I think is something that it is not a good basis. I think for policies. I think we should. On the one hand, have policies which respond to these legitimate constraints, concerns. I think the fact that so far we have not been successful, in spite of the many proposals that the Commission in particular has made to have an effective immigration policy in Europe, a common one, I think leads then to this type of or nourish this type of reactions. And I think one should take it also, I mean, maybe difficult, but take it also as an explicit objective of public, public policy. I mean, if you, I mean, rule of law with all the implications that it has, the main tenets of the liberal democracy I think should be probably taken up and being part of the any curriculum in a much more explicit way and more important way that is done now.
That's true. So just thinking of the German situation, which I'm a bit familiar with. So a couple of things just reflecting on what you told us. The first one is that the East grew up different, as we know. It grew up as the East. And they didn't have Kriegsschuld. They didn't have war guilt. They didn't have the post-war education system that placed responsibility on the Germans as historical subjects. So you have this very unique set of circumstances whereby it's old people who are just as xenophobic as the young people, which is very different from the West German experience. But there was a fascinating result in the German election, which is a wonderful little microcosm, is Berlin. So this is one city which has now been together since reunification, since 1989. And the national vote was replicated in the Berlin vote. The West Germans voted one way, and the East Germans qua East Berliners. Now, East Berlin, if you look at Mitte, is just as wealthy, etc., etc. So there's definitely something in there in terms of the Eastern Lander. So here's a hypothesis as to what it could be. The Eastern Lander have been a net tax drain against the German state for years, and there's quite a lot of solidarity, exhaustion, etc. going into this. Then we were buffeted by the big financial crisis. So even though Germany's been doing relatively well economically, it's simply not the case for the East Germans in that way. So when you bring in migrants, what you're talking about is competition for public goods. So the way I like to think about this is that immigration is felt very differently across the income distribution. So for me, immigration means somebody else with a PhD who's probably going to buy a house on the east side, and we'll hang around with them and my kids will play with their kids. There's no exclusion in this in terms of public goods or taxes or anything. We can deal. But if I'm in the bottom 20% and I'm in East Germany, I'm in public housing, and I'm constantly being told that you guys are a bunch of leeches and we're going to cut the money off and we're residualizing the welfare state, where do those people think all those migrants are going to end up? They're going to end up in welfare competition with them. So this is one of the ways in which the economics and the cultural aspects really do hit. So with that in mind, is there anything at all that an institution like the Commission can do to make states more aware of these dynamics or perhaps address it? Or is it simply something that governments at the national level have to deal with?
Well, I think, first of all, you said Berlin a bit paradigmatic of the national results, election result in Germany, and this East-Western divide is also, in a sense, paradigmatic of the broader divide between new member states who were, brought into Europe, and what you have is that. If you take, if you look at the number of studies by political scientists, they find that, the coalition of, the social coalition behind the illiberal democracies in Hungary and Poland, they are essentially between the working class on the one hand and the social, conservatives and reactionaries. So it has been, if you look at the typical center, left of center policy proposals, this it had the element of social equalization via, strong welfare system, so redistribution of policies, together with, let's say, social, liberal values. So they protect the, gay rights, other minorities, etc.
Minority protections,
But this here has never really appealed fully to, say, to working classes. Working classes, they tend to be, often, at least in these countries, pretty socially conservative. So what underpins Orban and Kaczynski in Poland and Hungary is this getting together of this social coalition of, let's say, working class, which have been looked after and with, let's say, in a sense, shielded by the threat of migrants who would come there and threaten you, together with the social conservatives, so the more reactionary view. So there has this this new social coalition is actually pretty cohesive and powerful. There is an element of coherence inside, which is important. And by the way, I mean, for those who do economics, as I have done myself, the reaction to integration when you bring together East and West within the single market, or East Germany and West Germany within Germany, is actually pretty coherent with what the classic trade theory, the Escher-Holling model, tells you. I mean, you have the loss in the actually rich countries. Population at the bottom of the scale. So now, what to do? I think difficult here. Again, I think one should probably rethink and revamp the structural policies and regional policies that we have in Europe. But a lot of this, I mean, considering the competencies that Europe has, really, at the end of the day, falls at the national level, unless one wants to reshuffle the competencies for which there is, I'm afraid, not much appetite right now.
So at the moment that you need, this is Macron's point, at the moment that you need more Europe, it's much, much harder to build Europe.
It is much harder to build Europe, but it is clearly, I mean, the return of politics. I mean, if you look at, I mean, crisis in general, and in particular such an existential crisis as the one we have lived over the past 10 years. I mean, here it's precisely 10 years from the beginning of the crisis now. And now we are out of the deepest moments of the crisis, but clearly the scars are still there, is the return of politics. Which, by the way, creates a problem with Germany, because Germany is essentially a rules-based country. And that's the way the Allied powers have actually built it in the, after the Second World War II, because we did not want to have a strong center which, go back to the 1930s, had produced what we know in Germany. So it's a very rules-based system with a not very powerful center at the federal level. So it is rules-based, and when you are facing crises and big shocks, the return of politics means actually a proactive approach, which is difficult to square with a rules-based one, which is much more the case of let's say discretionary a more activist, proactive approach of the case of France. So it's not by chance that comes from President Macron and not from Mrs. Merkel.
So just one more from me, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, because I just want to amplify this. In your diagram at the end, where you basically have the populace operating at the level of the market, which is a nice way of linking at it, there's one more complication that populists feed off of. They're not just anti-Europe, they're deeply anti-Euro. And one of the ways that they make their argument, which is not completely unreasonable, is the following. What the crisis showed was that if you're inside the Euro, you can't inflate your way out of trouble, even if in the long term that doesn't really work. And the euro, and you can't devalue because you don't have a currency. So you basically have to take the internal consumption hit. And that's something that they capitalize upon, and hence the demand for, we need a referendum on the euro, we need our own currency back, etc. So I just wonder if the euro has complicated this and, in a sense, amplified the dilemma that you've already identified. Because while you can imagine institutional fixes, etc., that would strengthen Europe, if you still have the euro there and populists are able to capitalize upon the euro itself as a problem, then does that deepen the problem that we see?
Okay, the answer is yes and no. Okay, the yes is clearly there are more constraints within the euro area. And you have seen in the first part of the crisis clearly a strong attack on the euro and on the rules that governing economic and monetary union. But the no is the preponderant answer. Actually, I've just seen, before coming here, together with the Providence, what is the name?
The journal. The
Providence Journal. I was reading also at the latest, just about to be released, Euro barometer, and the euro the euro is at the highest level of popularity ever since the beginning of the polling. You have 74% of people thinking that the euro is good for the not only for the EU, but also for your own country, which is the highest ever. And actually, if you look at the recent developments in Italy, the anti-Euro, anti-European parties, so the Lega Nord. But if you take also Marine Le Pen after the election, I mean, they have basically not pursued that type of that. They are backing out. And actually, one of the explanations for the debacle of Marine Le Pen in the second round was that she tried to peddle a bit that type of things, and clearly people looked at the portfolio and said, okay, getting out of the euro will become much poorer.
Right.
And obviously, this does not mean that there are many things to be fixed in the eurozone, but exiting is not something that. So these anti-European countries, I think they have less of an anti-Euro platform now than they had at the beginning.
All right, great. So let's open it up. Microphones are around. Who wants to go down there at the front, first of all?
So thank you for
one at a time.
Great talk. I just wanted to ask kind of a clarificatory question. In your definition of populist politics, you also mentioned the far left. But then when looking at your chart about France, for example, you could see that Mélenchon got an equal share of votes across the board. It didn't go with your pattern of rural, city, and educated, non-educated voters. So I was just hoping to hear a little bit more about how do you see left-wing populism in Europe today in general?
Is the left different from the right, really?
The left is different than the right. At the end of the day, it is true that you have anti-establishment parties on the left-hand side, but when it comes to the crunch, I think it's essentially the right wing that is, I think, more threatening. Now, on the, I mean, there is, I mean, the two elements, so the economic inequality, economic insecurity explanations, and the more cultural identitarian, they vary across countries. So if you take, I mean, broad brush, in Europe, those who are where there is more the cultural identitarian backlash, I think, is France. I think Britain, Brexit, I have indicated. If you, I mean, more on the left-wing populism, I think you have left-wing. Let's say you have in Greece. Greece has the two elements. I mean, it has also the Golden Dawn on the right hand side. But in terms of responding to the economic insecurity, sometimes the recipe is not all that different on the two sides of the spectrum. For Mélenchon, it is true that if you look across the different groups of population, it is, you know, there is not such a large divide. I think there it appeals also to high educated intellectual for the, let's say, the proposal of a bit, exiting the system and providing a policy response that has not been done by the socialist party.
So there's the CER piece that we talked about earlier, Simon's piece from London, also pointed out that if you have countries that have that are not East Germany because they were out of the loop, West Germany was different. If you have countries that were traumatized by extreme right-wing authoritarian or even extreme left-wing authoritarian, they tend to be much more resistant to sort of identity politics, politicizing migrants. Spain is a classic example. Portugal's also gone this way. Interestingly, so is Romania. Romania doesn't really have this type of backlash. In fact, they're one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, and they've actually got a kind of left/new left governance model based upon increasing equity investment, building on skills, etc. So very interesting, and they haven't had that, whereas a lot of their neighbours have. So there's definitely something in there in terms of the lessons the left can teach, rather than the right.
I mean, it is clear that if you take the two charts, the one with France with the vote of Macron and the vote of Le Pen and the correlation with social hardship, these were regions which traditionally, many years ago, voted for the left, so for the Socialist Party, and they have actually the voters they have switched from the left to the right. So and if you take the vote for the Social Democrats in Germany, that also you see they have actually in those regions they have switched from the Social Democrats in part to the Linke, so
the new left,
and in part to the Alternative for Deutschland.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
those trying to provide, let's say, an answer which is of a more direct way, weighing less the trade-offs, which are key in making credible policies.
Next question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is about the policy dilemma that you talked about between more Europe or less Europe as a response to populism. Do you think multi-speed Europe would help or be detrimental to resolving the problem?
I think, okay, first of all, we are managing now the exit of Britain, so in a sense, in the immediate future, consolidating the 27 remaining countries, I think, is an important political objective. En passant, I think it's important that to note that what was feared back last year, after the British referendum, the fact that there would be others actually claiming the same, the same status and wanting to exit has actually not materialized at all. And if you look at some of the referenda, including the painful developments now in Catalonia, or they want to exit their country to remain in Europe.
Right.
So that is this has not been clearly a trend in that. So consolidating 27, I think, has been an important political objective. And now, if one looks at the euro and the euro areas, which is the 19 out of the 27, at the horizon 2025, I think the most of the countries which are currently in Europe, the 27, will actually be in the eurozone if everything, if there is no new crisis derailing the system. At the same time, I think it is fair to say that for those who do not want to join the first group, the avant-garde, I think having the possibility to have an outer rim, I think it will be de facto one of the or let's say of the options of the inevitable outcome of the present system. Here, the key issue will be to what extent one overcomes, let's say, the Franco-German divide for the eurozone and comes forward with a solution on the euro area problems in terms of completing the architecture and providing and responding to the needs of the population, increasing stability, better macroeconomic policies, which would make the euro area more of a credible alternative. But we have not talked much about the geopolitical implications, but it is interesting to note that even when the eurozone was facing actually an existential crisis, so when actually we were not sure whether we would survive or not as the euro, even in that period there, the euro area continued to enlarge. So we actually, the Baltic countries actually joined the eurozone precisely when it was we were in the deepest trouble, and their reasoning was not so much an economic one; it was a geopolitical one. So, and I remember that when we were discussing about the joining of Latvia, the key reason was yes, we had made all this internal analysis with our very sophisticated models of pros and cons of joining the euro, the advantages, the benefits and the disadvantages. But the answer were very clear. We don't want to be bought as a country by a mid-range, Russian oligarch. That was the main reason.
Definitely. Just before we go to the next question, just one thought on that one. In fairness, it is a condition of, if you want to join the EU, you have to take the euro, right? So these are not separate choices, so that one goes with that. But Eastern Europe just now is fascinating to me. So you have essentially what I call the supply chain nations of the exporters in Eastern Europe. And a lot of these countries still have their own currency. They either have populists in charge who are saying, we're not joining the euro, or there's very sotto voce about when exactly they're going to do this. Because in a sense, what they're doing is a kind of Bretton Woods II strategy. So basically, here's the euro. I want to be just here so that my parts supplies going into Germany are incredibly competitive. And I still have that currency so I can play with this if I need it. If I go in, I'm in 100%, and that means I need to be as efficient as the Germans, which is always a big ask. That's why the Brits never wanted to join the euro. They knew they could never be as efficient as the Germans. So there's a nice strategy for the Eastern Europeans to play just now because it's working for them. But in the long run, does that create a problem? Because you do have this kind of two-speed or two zones whereby you've got the real euro countries and the kind of soft following it.
Okay, well, first of all, the fact of having your own currency versus joining the euro does not shield you against populist pressures.
Yeah,
so
true.
that is
that is
clear. So this is the first second point. Now, second point, you have there are credible or less credible strategies whether you have the single currency or you don't have the single currency. I mean, take the divide between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That was Czechoslovakia with the soft revolution, which led to the split of the country. One has decided to remain outside, so the Czech Republic, another one to go in, Slovakia. And if you look at the economic performance, they have actually done both pretty well.
Yeah.
I think you can, and if you look at the Slovakia in particular, the integration in the production chain, especially in the automotive industry with Germany, is actually pretty strong. So I think on this there is the possibility to have a credible strategy, whether you are in or whether you are out. You have one advantage of staying out. You have the insurance policy in a sense of having the possibility to use your independent monetary policy. At the same time, if you are in, you have better chance to influence the common policies. So I think it's a fine balance here. But there is, I think, not a deterministic answer to that question. I believe.
I wanted to come back to the idea of Macron as a savior for Europe, kind of, and I was wondering if you thought that the structure of the French state, which is really centralized and based on kind of a big inequality between Paris as the metropolitan area and the rural communities, if you thought that could fuel the populist arguments that kind of base themselves off of this discrepancy between the elites and the lesser rural populations, to have a leader from a country like France based on such a central authority, and he even guaranteed power even more for him, gaining so many votes in the parliamentary elections. Do you see that as a problem to champion this figure who himself represents a new birth for Europe as kind of a fuel to the populist fire?
Okay, let me tell you a little story, which is of a personal nature. I worked for many years in the Commission, and I was there when some of you may know, Jacques Delors was president of the Commission. No? Jacques Delors was president between, I think, 85 and 93. So and towards the end of, of his tenure as Commission president, he had to decide whether to run for president of France or not. And it was an excruciating dilemma for him. And actually, many of the polls at the time were actually predicting that he could win the presidency. And this is back in, I think, 1992. By the way, just a folkloristic connotation. I was working in the cabinet of the Italian Commissioner at the time. So I went to the meeting of the Commission every Wednesday, sitting beside as a young official behind the and Jacques Delors, he had while he was making this huge decision of whether to run or not, he also had a problem with sciatic problem. So it was a combination of psychological excruciating dilemma with a physical pain. So I remember it was but this I closed the bracket here for the touch of color into that. Eventually, he decided not to run. And he decided not to run essentially because he wanted to disarticulate the left and the right, and recompact a majority along pro-Europe and against Europe. And this was the time, 1985, second half of the 1990s, where, of the 1980s, where there was euphoria, and essentially fueled by the program of completion of the single market, and so on and so forth. His decision was, and he explained it at the time, was not to run because he thought France was not ripe for a disarticulation of the political system along those lines. So we had to wait for how many years? 30 years? Almost 25 years for the same opportunity to come back again. And Macron has been able to do it in, I think, profiting as Bonaparte's generals with a bit of luck, because of Fillon, disgrace. But he did it anyway, and it was actually pretty extraordinary if you think about also the electoral system that you have in France. I think what has played there is. I think he was very forceful and very brave in putting forward a courageous pro-European program. I think he played on optimism and not fear. And he came forward with a very innovative proposal. So the element of novelty was what differentiated him from especially the Socialist Party, to which he belonged de facto, if not probably the year before that. So no, it is clear that one would want to have a model of European integration which allows more flexibility, and how do you square this with a more centralized set of competencies? I think is a clear dilemma. So how you struggle between the two, I think, is a big issue. So not coming to a super state, I think, is part of the let's say solution.
Just building off of that before we go to the next question, can Merkel still deliver? As we noted, the SPD's out. Her vote share is down at the lowest for her party since 1948. The Liberals are coming back, and we know what happened last time when Steinbrück was kicked out and then the budgetary policy changed. Does she still have the political capital to help Macron get where he needs to go?
Okay, let me say, first of all, I do not agree with those who say, okay, you had a window of opportunity with the election of Macron, and the window of opportunity has closed already because of the German elections.
Okay.
Now, first of all, I think we have yourself also complained a lot in the past about German policies.
Absolutely. I'm married to one, I'm allowed to.
So now, I think a safe prediction here is whatever coalition will come in, so if the Jamaica coalition with the Liberals and the Greens come in, a safe prediction, higher spending.
Right.
I think there will be higher spending and less taxes. I think there will be, the FDP will push for lower taxation, and the Greens will push for higher spending. So I think higher investment, higher public investment will be the name of the game. So I think this will help to fuel demand demand in Germany, I think lower the imbalances in Germany. So I think this would be good for second point. I think thinking that Germany would become much more inward looking, as you see as in the commentaries in the newspapers nowadays, actually would imply that the problems and the issues which have come to the fore with the vote of the Alternative for Deutschland would, I mean, the response to those concerns would actually be one found at the national level. But this is not the case, because I mean, if the concerns are those about migration, about other threats of that sort, security, with many terrorist attack in Germany, the answer here to these threats cannot be only national. It has to be European. So a security policy at the European level, migration policy at the European level.
Yeah.
So from that viewpoint, one would actually see more engagement in Germany in finding the European solution, not a more inward-looking Germany. The final point, the Liberal Party has a history which is a bit contradictory, let's say, because the Liberal Party was, at the time of Kohl, was with Genscher, who was the foreign minister at that time, was the most pro-European party of the lot in Germany. A lot has changed since then, but they tend to be a pretty pragmatic one. So I would hope that ideology does not dominate in their choices in the future.
Excellent. Any more questions?
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was something that Professor Blyth alluded to, but I was hoping you could expand on. The picture seems pretty bleak, but there were hints that there could be perhaps best practices or a model in which the rest of the Europeans could emulate with regard to being able to resist populism. And I was just hoping that you could expand on this. Is the resistance to populism more a function of national endowments like demography or perhaps previous policy, or is there a set of interventionist best practices that could be taken with regard to this?
Okay, well, let me say, first of all, if I go back with my memory to last year, exactly the same day, almost the same day as I was here, which we had behind us the Brexit vote.
Yep.
In front of us, the risk of Le Pen in France, and with an splintering or doubts on the economic recovery, and you fast forward to now, we are in a much better position than we were. True, AfD share large, but still by far not prevailing. And we have Macron in France. We have an economic recovery which actually is robust and pretty broad-based. You look at the economic indicators, consumer sentiment and business sentiment published actually this morning. It is continuing to go up. So the recovery is very strong in that. So I think we are in a better position. Now, in these cases here, what we know is that the risk is the one of complacency instead of making the right policy choices. We know that often we make more policy mistakes in good terms than in bad terms, in bad times. So I think we have to find the right recipe. I don't believe in one size fits all, and I do not believe in best practices in a country being transposed into another country and working perfectly there. I think we have always to be aware of the Frankenstein effect. It's not by putting together different pieces that the guy that comes out of that works properly. You know? So I think there is a country-specific element. Nonetheless, some of the trends that we have identified here, I think, are pretty powerful. I think there is. I think my personal thing is that the most difficult area to tackle, and we'll have to think very hard on how to do it, is the rural-urban divide. That is, pretty entrenched and not easy, not amenable to easy policy answers. On others, I think one can do that with difficult policy choices, but manageable ones.
Yep.
That one seems to be very hard to crack.
So the example of that is the Boston-Lincolnshire effect. So for those who don't know, this is a rural community in the United Kingdom. It's got actually a very reasonably high sort of per capita GDP, etc. But what they've had is very stagnant wage growth for a long time, and they're an agricultural community. So even though they're wealthy, where do they get the workers? Because if you're kind of wealthy and things have been okay, your kids leave. They go to college and they go to London, they don't come back. So what you end up with is the delta. It's the change in the demographic makeup. You've got lots of Czechs and Slovaks and Latvians and everything else coming in. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is great. First of all, they're just way smarter than your average Brit. Most of them are much better looking. You'd think this would be win-win, right? But apparently there's some resistance to this, particularly amongst older folks. And that's a really hard one. That's a very hard one to deal with, because you can legitimately say, but your economy is doing better. But they can legitimately say, yes, but now 20% of the village is completely different and I feel isolated. And policies for that, they're very, very hard to find those best practices that deal with those situations. If it's simply an income skew, we know how to deal with that. It's hard, but you can choose to attack it or not. But those types of things, they're actually very, very difficult to fine-tune and try and find policy solutions for. One more question and then we're gone.
Are there any economic incentives for these rural, less educated voters to vote pro-immigration?
To vote pro?
Immigration. Why should the people in the rural areas who are against this stuff be for it? Is there a case that can be made?
Look, I think one of the risks that we have in rural Europe, rural part of countries, is economic desertification. So the demography runs against you. I think having, accepting that to have via immigration a more dynamic demography, I think helps to save the those rural parts. That's I think this is the answer that economists would give. Not easy to communicate in the in the heat of the moment, but I think overall I think is the right. I continue to be that is the right answer. Clearly, and one has to be honest in that. The type of immigration that one has, in terms of the kind of cultural values that are being brought in. For refugees, which very legitimately ask for help and assistance, but at the same time have some problems in accepting minimal value of the Western type, I think creates objectively problems that are difficult to deal with. So I think the easy answer that one should accept everybody without any conditions. I think it is too easy.
Yeah, it's too easy for that one. There you go. Thank you very much. Your yearly update from the Commission.